There he goes.
Not most times, but sometimes.
Go like that.
Definitely not during
Just don't
gun
be
battles.
gangster.
Yeah, that's true.
Just be around.
I would be a very straight-laced
All right, so meanwhile, back at the ranch here, the reason we endure is because we've been promised a reward. And we know that after having done the will of God, after being faithful in life, like who else was faithful?
Say it louder.
Say like a man.
Jesus was faithful.
Yes, Jesus was faithful. Like being faithful like him, then we will receive what was promised. The promise of God is what we can't see, but we trust in the promise of God, and so we act by faith or by faithfulness. That's the whole idea here. So what's going to happen now, and he's been running so long, the little Jeremiah 31:31 guy has been running a long time, and he's really tired, and he's coming around the track, and he's about to hand the baton off to the Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 3 and 4 guy. And so here he comes. He's a-coming. And he hands it off. He says, "For in yet a very little while he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one shall live by faith," which I would translate, don't hate me, by faithfulness. "And if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him." Now I want you to particularly underline verse 38. My righteous one will live by faith or by faithfulness. Now if you'll look at the next verse, if he shrinks back. See, that's the opposite of being faithful. Now, if you'll go to the verse that introduced this quotation, it says, you have need of endurance. Endurance is the same as what, church? Faithfulness. You have need of endurance, that having done the will of God, you will inherit what is promised. So, my righteous one will live by faithfulness, but if he shrinks back, if he gives it up, if he doesn't hold fast his confession, then my soul has no pleasure in him. Now, as the Hebrew writer uses this passage, who do you think is the one who is going to come and will not delay? Who do you think that is, who's going to come after a little while?
The Messiah.
That's Jesus, see? But it's the ones who live by faithfulness and don't give up, see, that are going to inherit the promise when he comes. All right, now, see that little red phrase there, by faith or by faithfulness? We'll have to argue over that later. That phrase right there is why you have the phrase repeated in chapter 11. By faith this, by faith that in chapter 11 comes from this verse right here. All of that chapter 11 is a commentary on Habakkuk chapter 2 verses 3 and 4. Okay? We may call it the faith chapter, but it's really the faithfulness chapter. And the righteous are the ones that live by faithfulness, and they're the ones that are going to inherit the promise. All right, now we're going to keep that thought as we go forward. Go back to verse 35, which says, do not throw away your confidence. Well, see, that's like the phrase in verse 38, if he shrinks back, my soul has no pleasure in him. Shrinking back is like throwing away your confidence. That's the opposite of endurance and doing the will of God and faithfulness. Do you feel me or not?
Yes.
Okay. So we are not of those who shrink back. unto destruction or punishment, taking it out of verse 38. But of those who have faith, I would translate that, those who are faithful unto the saving of the soul. All right, and then he's going to give a whole bunch of examples of this in chapter 11. All right, now, faith. I'm still going to want to translate that faithfulness because, notice, faithfulness or faith is the substance of things hoped for. Now, if you'll go back to verse 35, that which is hoped for is the reward in verse 35, unless I miss my guess. And if you go to verse 36, you have need of endurance, which is a synonym for faithfulness, so that having done the will of God, you will receive what is promised. See, that's what's hoped for in Hebrews 11, verse 1. What is promised is the same as what is hoped for. All right? And it is a conviction of things not seen. The things not seen are the things that God has promised us that we haven't gotten yet. See? But we're trusting in a God who cannot lie, Hebrews 6:18. And we believe in those promises so strongly that we're willing to endure and to maintain our confidence and to hold fast our confession, see, so that we can receive the will of God. All right, so in this regard, the elders had testimony borne to them. Now, I don't know where they get this gained approval, but if you can look at a Greek text in chapter 11, verse 2, I think they're correct in translating this, the men of old, because it's referring to the Old Testament people that did this, but it's presbyteroi. By this, or in this way, that is by being faithful, the verb here is martureo, but it's passive. They had witness borne to them. Does anybody's translation say they had witness or testimony borne to them? Raise your paws up if your translation says that. Drew, what are you reading?
ASV.
The NASB?
The ASV.
Oh, the ASV. Okay, good. That is a very good translation. So the Old Testament testifies or bears witness to the faithfulness of these people. All right? And that's how they gained approval. Not just by believing in God, but by doing God's will, like it says in verse 36. You have need of endurance, that having done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. Okay? Describe in one word why I'm trying to translate this faithfulness instead of faith. What's making me do that in one word?
Context.
Come on, Jeremiah. Come on in. Bring it in.
Oh, that's my first one right there. Airhead.
Bring it in. Let's give it a big old, good old hug. That's exactly right. That's what's driving the boat here, is the context. All right. Now, faithfulness means trusting in the Word. By faith or faithfulness, we understand that the worlds were prepared by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Faith and faithfulness looks backward as well as forward. There are some things we trust that we can't see that happened way back then, and we trust because God tells us that's what happened. See, if God tells us, then we accept it, we trust in it, and we build our lives on it. Now, 11:3 is interesting because the word for worlds is ionos. It's usually kosmoi. But it's ionos, like you have in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 2. By him he made the ionos, the worlds. Whatever that means. The natural creation, evidently, because it's things that are seen, the physical things, were made out of things which do not appear. So by faith, or faithfulness, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain. Now both Cain and Abel believed in God. But Abel, because he was faithful, he did what God told him to do, see? And he offered a better sacrifice than Cain. Through which he had witness borne to him that he was righteous. Now look at verse 4 on the screen. Notice I've got those words highlighted in red. By faith or faithfulness, he was righteous. Look back at chapter 10, verse 38, and see if there's any connection in with those red words there in 10:38.
The righteous is the one that lives by faithfulness. So
That's right. So
was
you've
right.
got the same phrases here. Do you think he's drawing off of 10:38 and 11:4?
That might be the case.
Yes, you do think it. And you think it because there it is in the text, and he's doing what he's done before. He presents a text, and he's discussing that text. Remember when he was discussing Psalm 95, 7 through 11, he pulled out words like today and heart and hardened and rest in the rest of the discussion. Now he's pulling out words like righteous and faith or faithfulness. He's pulling it out of that text, see? So Abel did the will of God. He was faithful, and he was declared righteous because it's the righteous that live by faith or faithfulness. So God was bearing witness to him, like it says in verse 1, the elders had testimony borne unto them. See? God was bearing witness to him in respect of his gifts, and through it, even though he's dead, he still speaks. What he's saying, even though he's dead, is if you trust God and do what he says, God will bless you, see? And you'll be rewarded. That's what he's saying, even though he's dead. By faith, now this is a good one. By faith or faithfulness, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. Now watch this. And he was not found, for God took him up. For, underline this, he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. Now see that phrase right there? He was pleasing to God. That whole phrase is a synonym for what? He was pleasing to God is another way of saying that he was
Righteous.
or
Faithful.
faithful. Yes, both. So, notice, before he was taken up, he was pleasing to God. That shows you what by faithfulness means. Because he was pleasing to God. How do you please God? You do what God says. You live it out in your life. And that's why he was translated or taken up. Because before he was translated, he was pleasing to God. In Genesis 5, verse 24, instead of saying he was pleasing to God, what is the phrase? Enoch what? That's not fair to ask you that. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. So walked with God in Genesis 5:24 is like he was pleasing to God in Hebrews 11 verse 5, which is the same thing as being faithful to God. Which if you go back to 10:36, it's the same as having done the will of God, you will inherit what is promised. See? Which is all about being faithful. All right? it's not about just believing that there's a God. That's not what this chapter is about. It's about being faithful to God. And without faith, which I would translate again, faithfulness, it is impossible to please him. For he who comes to God must do two things. He must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Those who keep seeking God, those are the faithful. The devils believe in God, but they don't keep seeking God. They don't diligently seek God in their everyday life. That's faithfulness. They're not pleasing to God like Enoch was. They're not acting on the word of God like Abel was. See? He is a rewarder. See that word rewarder, Aaron? In verse 6? Find me a passage earlier where it mentions that reward.
I'm not.
Somebody else can find it. If Aaron, he can't find it, somebody else help him.
1035.
Good job. Is that Sarah?
Yeah.
Rock on, Sarah. 1035. Do not throw away your confidence, which has great reward. For you have need of endurance, that having done the will of God, you may receive what is promised. So the reward in verse 35 is the same as what is promised in verse 36, right?
Yeah.
So those who are faithful are the ones that receive the reward. Hebrews chapter 10, or chapter 11, verse 6. All right? By faith, Noah, he believed in God. But he did more than that. He was faithful. Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen. God said to Noah, there's going to be a floody. That's a promise, isn't it? It's a promise that they could not see. It's a promise that they could not see, and it never had rained before. But God said there's going to be a floody. Get those children out of the muddy. So trusting in what he could not see, Noah prepared an ark for the saving of his household, by which he condemned the world and became an heir of, watch it now, the righteousness which is by faith, or by faithfulness. Go back to 10:38, Habakkuk 2, verse 4. The righteous shall live by faithfulness. See the righteousness which is according to faith there in verse 7. Go back to verse 4. Does it say about faithfulness and righteous in verse 4? It do, don't it? And both verse 4 and verse 7 go back to 10:38. The righteous shall live by faith. Are you tracking with me or not tracking with me?
Yep.
Okay. By faithfulness, or faith, Abraham, when he was called, obeyed by going out to a place which he was to receive for an inheritance. See, God said, Abraham, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee. And so he moved, he went, he traveled all the way from Sumer, all the way up the Euphrates, way north past the Arabian desert to Haran in Syria, and then all the way south past Damascus and down into the land of Canaan. That was a lot of going. That was faithfulness. And he went out not knowing where he was going. But his going out, even though he couldn't see what God promised, God said, I'm going to take you to a land, a country. He'd never been there. But he went out to it, trusting God to lead him there, because faithfulness is the substance of things you hope for and the evidence of things that you can't see. All right? So by faith, or faithfulness, I think, he lived as an alien in the land of promise, as in a foreign land, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs of the same promise. See, if you'll take that word promise, and if you'll underline that back into chapter 10, and every time it says a reward or a better possession or a promise, you'll see that word over and over again. So faithfulness is acting based on the promises of God. We live in the present based on the promises of God, that there's going to be a resurrection, there's going to be a judgment, there's going to be an eternity. See? And because we believe those promises, Jesus is coming again. The dead are going to be raised. We're all going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ. Some will go into the holy city. Some will go into the lake of fire. Those are promises. We believe them, but we don't just believe them, we act on them. We're faithful based on those promises. For he, that's Abraham, was looking for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Well, see, if you go back to chapter 10, verse 35, do not throw away your confidence, which has a great reward. Or 10:34 is what I meant. Knowing that we have a better and lasting possession. We'll see that better and lasting possession that even Abraham was looking for was the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. See, I'm going to view that holy city. See, that holy city is Jerusalem. It is the heavenly Jerusalem that we're looking forward to, whose builder and maker is God. Okay. Oh, yeah. Somebody else is telling me that my mailbox is full. That's irritating when that happens. You have to delete emails or else your mailbox will get full. Okay. Notice here in verse 11, by faith even Sarah herself received the ability to conceive even beyond the proper time of life, because she considered him faithful who promised. Now in Genesis 18, when those three men, who were two angels and God, came to visit Abraham, God said, about this time next year, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening in the tent, and she started cackling, laughing. And God said, you laughed. And she said, no, I didn't. He said, yes, you did. You laughed. But it's going to happen. And I'm going to name him Little He Laughed, because you laughed. And in Genesis 17, Abraham laughed when God said that. But Sarah was 90 years old. Sonny? You know? And she had already forgotten about menopause. It was so long back there, she'd forgotten about it. And Abraham, well, he had long passed, he was 100 years old. He had long passed the age of siring children, but God said, about this time next year, you will have a son. And in Romans chapter 4, starting with about verse 17 or 18, if memory serves. Just as it is written, a father of many nations I have made you, before which he believed the God of the living, he believed the living God, who calls things that are not as though they are, who, talking about Abraham, he hoped against hope, and he believed, so that he might become the father of many nations, according to what was spoken. This is the promise. So shall your seed be. And not being weakened in faith, he considered his own body already as good as dead, and being 100 years old, and the deadness of Sarah's womb, he did not waver in unbelief, but was empowered by faith, giving glory to God, and what was promised was fulfilled, that God was able to do. He believed that what was promised, God was able to do. Wherefore, it was credited to him as righteousness. So, Abraham and Sarah finally got the notion from God that God wasn't kidding, that they were promised to have a son, and they trusted in that. And God enabled them to conceive a child, which they did by faith. And they ended up having this child because they acted in faithfulness. All right, so Abraham and Sarah went on their 14th honeymoon when they were 190 years old. Verse 12, therefore there was born even of one man, and him as good as dead at that, as many as the descendants as the stars of the heaven in number, and is innumerable on the sand which is on the seashore. All these died in faith. That means, I think, in faithfulness, without receiving the promises. See, there were promises that went beyond them. What did the promise mean to Abraham? In your seed, all the nations of the earth would be blessed. Well, he believed in that, but he didn't know how that was going to play out. But he still was faithful to God. Say, without receiving the promises, but having seen them and greeted them from a distance, and having confessed that they were strangers and exiles on the earth. So these people were looking for a reward out there somewhere, trusting in the promises of God. For those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. Now see, this country that they're seeking, if you go back to verse, 10? He says, Abraham was looking for that city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. This says he was looking for a country of his own. If you go back to 10:34, he was looking for a better and lasting possession. See, this is the ultimate promise that God has made. So those who say such things make it clear that they are seeking a country of their own. And indeed, if they had been thinking of the country from which they went out, they would have had opportunity to return. Now, he's kind of being symbolic here. Think about this. In the book of Hebrews, Abraham left Ur of Chaldees and went to Canaan by faith. The Israelites left Egypt and marched toward Canaan land. Some of them failed to enter into that rest, but they left something and they were going to something else. That passage that Aaron quoted a little while ago, we have fled from something and we're laying hold on something else. See? So these people, if they wanted to, they could have gone back to where they were before. But we don't want to go back to where we were before, whatever we were in before. But as it is, see, faithful people desire a better country that is a heavenly one. Notice the word better there, a better country. Compare that to 10:34 again. Knowing that they have a better and lasting possession. Think we're talking about the same thing or not? A better country, that is a heavenly one. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. See, we're going to go to a city. And it's a city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And it's in a better country. Now that city in the Bible is Jerusalem. But it's the New Jerusalem. See, we don't like to say that because we think that sounds like the Jehovah's Witnesses, and that's dumb because the Bible is full of that terminology. And just because the Jehovah's Witnesses use some biblical terminology doesn't mean we shouldn't use that biblical terminology. The place that we're going is called the New Jerusalem in the Bible. That's what it's called. The place where we're going after the judgment is not heaven. Because heaven will come down to earth after the judgment. Revelation 21, and I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. Now, if we die right now, we will go to heaven. Because right now, heaven is separated from man. There's two different realms. But after the judgment, there won't be any heaven. The New Jerusalem will come down to man, see? And there will be a new earth, new heavens and a new earth. That's what the Bible says. I didn't write it. I'm just reporting it. So, God is preparing that city for us now. But that city is what we have described in the book of Hebrews here. It's a city that God has prepared. It's a city with foundations whose builder and maker is God. And it's described in Hebrews 12, verse 22, as Mount Zion, the heavenly Jerusalem. Hebrews 12, verse 22. And it's described in Hebrews 13, verse 14, where he says, we do not have here an abiding city, but we seek for that city which is to come. Nobody wants to ask a question on any of that before we leave it and keep trucking? Everybody's good?
Well, I got confused when you were talking about us not going to heaven, but Jerusalem. Can you say that again?
Okay. Jesus talked about in Matthew 5, if we're persecuted for righteousness, great is our reward in heaven, because so they persecuted the prophets that were before us. So if I die right now, I'm going to go to heaven, because the abode of God, the abode of the faithful, like in Revelation 6, 9, Revelation 7, 13, and 14, is in heaven with God. If I die, if I don't die, if Jesus comes and we have the judgment, then heaven's going to come down to earth. Revelation 21, 1 and 2. In other words, right now, man is in one realm, an earthly physical realm, and God is in another realm. But after the judgment, there's not going to be two realms. God is going to be with man. And the wording of Revelation 21, 1, I saw a new heaven and a new earth. The first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and the sea is no more. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And he hears a voice saying, now the dwelling place of God is with men. So that's what we're looking forward to at the end, according to the good book. 2 Peter 3, 13? According to his promise, we look for new heavens and a new earth in which dwells righteousness. Where is that promise? Well, it's Isaiah 65, 17. Behold, I create new heavens and a new earth. And I create Jerusalem a rejoicing, and her children a joy. And there will no more be heard in her the sound of weeping and the sound of crying. Isaiah 65, 17, FF. And Peter said, according to his promise, we look for new heavens and new earth wherein dwelleth righteousness. Again, I don't write it. I'm just reporting it. Anybody else? Clarify. What about this? What about that? Is it Aaron?
Yes, sir. I'm wondering, as he's going through and talking about our faithfulness, it says that Sarah considered God to be faithful.
Yes,
Is
in
that-
other words, God had made a promise, and based on the fact that God does not lie, Sarah acted. And that action on her part was faithfulness, because she considered God to be faithful in keeping his promise to her.
Okay, so God is faithful in that he keeps his promise, and we are faithful in that we respond to that promise.
That's exactly right, and we keep on responding. We don't stop responding
Right.
to his promise. It's like Noah believed that God was faithful to his promise because God promised it was going to rain. But Noah acted in faithfulness to that promise and built him a boat. It took him a long time to build it. Okay? Somebody else. All right, so God has prepared for them a city. By faithfulness or faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. Now see, he offered up Isaac. That's how he was faithful. He trusted God, and God said, I want you to go do this. And he did the will of God, even though it was difficult. And so he took Isaac to Mount Moriah, where Jerusalem is built. And he, let me see here. He was taking his son, and the son said, Father, here's the wood, and here's the knife, and here's the fire, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide the lamb for the burnt offering. And when Abraham was going up to worship with Isaac, taking him to sacrifice him, he said, me and the boy will go over here and worship, and then we will be coming back again. Because, see, God had promised, I'm going to make a great nation out of Isaac. And in Isaac shall your seed be called. Genesis 21, verse 12. So Abraham knew that if that was true, Isaac had to come back alive. He knew that because God promised. See? So trusting in the promise of God, which you see there in verse 18. It was he, Isaac, to whom it was said, or Abraham, to whom it was said, in Isaac shall your descendants be called. And he considered that God is able to raise people even from the dead, from which he also did receive him back in a figure. So Abraham so much believed in the promise of God that he was willing to kill his son, because he believed somehow God would make Isaac live and come back alive. Now again, this is one of the great passages to show that monogenes does not mean only begotten, because Isaac was not the only boy that Abraham begat. Before Abraham ever begat Isaac, he begat Ishmael, didn't he? But Isaac was indeed the monogenes, the unique son, because he was born by a miracle in their old age with God's help. See? He was monogenes, but he was not the only one begotten. That's not a good translation of that word. This is a verse that proves that, if you need one. So he trusted the promise of God, and he acted on the promise of God. And God had that ram caught in the bushes. And it worked out okay. By faith, Isaac blessed Jacob and Esau even regarding things to come. What does that mean? Well, God, see, in that blessing was making a prophecy. God said, this is what's going to happen in the future. And Isaac, believing God that this was what was going to happen in the future, he pronounced that prophetic blessing to Jacob and said, the older one's going to serve the younger one. And this is what's going to happen to the younger one, because he believed in the promise of God.